My sister called me a gold digger at Dad's funeral, then the lawyer opened the second will. The room was silent except for the sound of someone crying softly near the back. I was standing in the front row of the funeral parlor, holding a single white carnation, my father's favorite, when my sister leaned toward me, close enough that I could smell her perfume, and said it loud enough for 3 rows of people to hear. "You only came back because of the money." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat had closed completely. I just stood there staring at the mahogany casket while she took a small step away from me, as if proximity to me might contaminate her grief. 47 people were in that room. I counted later, the way you count things when you're trying to stay sane. 47 people, and at least 30 of them heard what she said. I watched the ripple move through the crowd, that slight shift in posture, that invisible lean away from me, and I understood, in that moment, that I had already been tried and convicted in a room full of people I'd known my entire life. What nobody in that room knew, not my sister, not the cousins, not the family friends in their dark suits, was that 48 hours later, a lawyer named Gerald Okoye would walk into a conference room at the county offices and open a second envelope. An envelope that would change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because to understand what was in that envelope, you first have to understand who my father was, who I was, and what really happened in that house over the last 4 years of his life. The town of Millhaven, Ohio sits exactly 62 miles east of Columbus, far enough to feel forgotten but close enough to carry the persistent ache of being left behind. It's the kind of place where the diner on Main Street has had the same laminated menus since 1994, where the hardware store still has a pegboard behind the counter with handwritten price tags, and where everybody knows what car you drive, who you married, and roughly what you earn. The population peaked at around 11,000 in the early 80s. By the time my father died on the morning of March 14, 2022, it had settled somewhere below 8. My father, Raymond Earl Whitfield, had lived in the same house on Canfield Road for 51 years. He bought it in 1971 for $22,000, which was more money than he had ever seen at one time. He was 24 years old, newly married, and certain, the way only young men can be certain, that everything was going to work out exactly as he imagined. Raymond was a machinist by trade. He worked 33 years at a mid-size manufacturing plant 30 minutes north of Millhaven, the kind of place that made components nobody outside of industry had ever heard of, precision parts for agricultural equipment, bushings, shafts, housings. He understood tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. He believed in work that you could hold in your hands. He had no patience for abstraction. He also had 2 children who turned out to be almost perfectly opposite. My sister, Diane, left Millhaven at 18 with a full academic scholarship to Northwestern. She studied finance. She got her MBA from Wharton. She joined a consulting firm in Chicago. She called every Sunday for about 4 years and then every other Sunday, and then, eventually, the calls became something you scheduled rather than something that simply happened. I was the other one. My name is Marcus, and I stayed. Not because I had to. Not because I failed. I want to be clear about that, even though nobody in that funeral room would have believed it. I had options. I had a degree in mechanical engineering from Ohio State. I had job offers. I had, at one point, an apartment lease signed for a position in Pittsburgh. But in the winter of 2018, my father had his first stroke. It was a Tuesday. I was 29 years old. I was sitting at my desk in Pittsburgh, 6 weeks into a new job, when my mother, who had been holding everything together on her own, called me and said, quietly, "Marcus, I need you to come home." She didn't say please. My mother never said please. That's how I knew it was serious. I drove through the night. I arrived at Millhaven General just after 4 in the morning. My father was lying in a hospital bed with the left side of his face pulled slightly downward, like gravity had developed a preference. He looked at me when I walked in. He recognized me. That was the good news. The doctor said he had about 60% function on his left side. With therapy, maybe 75. He would need care. He would need time. He would need, most of all, patience, and my father had spent so many years giving patience to metal that he had very little left for his own limitations. My mother could not do it alone. I could see that immediately. So I stayed. I I want to be honest about something. At first, people were supportive. The neighbors brought casseroles. My father's old coworkers stopped by on weekends. My mother's church friends organized a schedule so that someone was always available if she needed an hour to herself. For about 6 months, the community wrapped itself around that house on Canfield Road the way small towns do, with warmth that is imperfect but real. Then the casseroles stopped coming. Then the check-ins became less frequent. And then, slowly, the narrative began to shift. It started with small things. A comment from my Aunt Rosemary at Thanksgiving, 2019, I think, about how she hoped I had some kind of plan because you can't just not have a career, Marcus. The way she said it, careful and concerned, as if my life was a slow-motion accident she was watching from a safe distance. Then my cousin Derek, who had moved to Denver and started some kind of marketing agency, made a comment at Christmas about how noble it was that I was taking care of my dad, but that I should be thinking about my future. He used the word noble like it was the polite version of something else entirely. Then there was the thing that happened at the 4th of July barbecue in 2020, when I overheard 2 of my father's friends talking near the fence at the back of the yard. I wasn't supposed to hear. I was standing in the kitchen window, washing cups, and the window was cracked. Raymond's got that house, doesn't he? And the pension? And they said he had investments too. You think that's why Marcus stayed? A pause. Well, he never left, did he? I stood there with a dish in my hand and let that sentence settle into me like a stone into still water. I said nothing. I went back to washing the cups. But the idea had been planted. And ideas like that grow fast in small towns with long memories and not enough to talk about. Diane heard it, of course. She came home for holidays. She was always present for the significant occasions, and I watched her absorb the whispers the way a lawyer absorbs evidence. She was careful with me, civil, but there was something behind her eyes during those visits that I couldn't quite name, a kind of assessment that made me feel like I was constantly being evaluated against a rubric I hadn't been given. By 2021, my mother had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's. The house on Canfield Road became something entirely different. It became a small medical facility run by a man with an engineering degree and no formal training, fueled by YouTube tutorials, pharmaceutical pamphlets, and a stubbornness that my father, even in his diminished state, recognized and respected. I kept records. Not because I was strategic. I kept records because that's what engineers do. They document, they track, they measure. I had notebooks full of medication schedules, therapy notes, doctor's appointment summaries. I had a spreadsheet tracking my father's blood pressure readings going back 18 months. Nobody asked to see any of that. Nobody thought to ask. People have a tendency to flatten the people they know into simple versions of themselves, the ones that are easiest to carry around. In Millhaven, I was the son who stayed. That was the whole sentence. No modifier, no footnote. The son who stayed, which carried with it the implicit question nobody asked out loud. But why? What people saw when they looked at me was a 32-year-old man who drove a 2011 Ford pickup with a cracked dashboard, wore canvas work jackets from the co-op supply store, and spent most of his weekends either fixing things around his parents' house or sitting at the kitchen table doing paperwork nobody else wanted to deal with. They saw someone ordinary, unremarkable, a man who had made a quiet life out of limited options. What they didn't see, because it wasn't visible, was what I had been doing with the time. Here's a thing about caregiving that nobody talks about. It comes with enormous amounts of waiting. Waiting at doctors' offices. Waiting for prescriptions. Waiting for therapy sessions to end. Waiting through the long, slow afternoons when your father is sleeping and the house is quiet, and the only sound is the refrigerator cycling on and off. I used that time. I used it the way a person uses everything when they are quietly running out of conventional options. Not frantically, not with some dramatic sense of purpose, just steadily, the way my father once described the way you machine a shaft. You make one pass, then another. You don't try to take everything off at once. You take 1,000th of an inch at a time, and eventually you have something precise. The thing I was machining, without fully realizing it, was knowledge. What nobody at that funeral knew, what nobody in that room with their dark suits and their careful sympathy had any reason to suspect, was that the quiet man holding the white carnation in the front row had spent 4 years building something. But to understand what I built, you first have to understand what I learned from my father. Not during the caregiving years. Before that. Long before that. My father didn't talk about money the way most people do. He didn't talk about it as ambition or as comfort or as freedom, the way you read about in books. He talked about it the way he talked about his work, as something that required precision, patience, and respect for tolerances. Money is like metal, he told me once. I was maybe 14, sitting on an overturned milk crate in his garage while he worked on the neighbor's lawnmower engine. It doesn't care what you want. It behaves according to its own rules. Your job is to understand the rules. I didn't fully understand what he meant at 14. But I filed it away, the way I filed most things he said, in some back compartment of my memory that I didn't know I was building. My father had a library. Not a large one. One wall of the den, floor to ceiling, built-in shelves he'd made himself from walnut he'd reclaimed from a downed tree in the backyard. The books were mostly practical. Engineering manuals, farming almanacs, a complete set of World Book encyclopedias from 1978, and a section of paperbacks that he'd collected over the years on personal finance, investing, and property. Not investment banking. Not get-rich strategies. Boring, methodical books about compounding, about land, about how money accumulated quietly over decades if you left it alone. He had a copy of an old Benjamin Graham text so dog-eared it barely held together. He had Philip Fisher. He had a copy of Thoreau's Walden that had nothing to do with investing but which he claimed had everything to do with understanding what you actually needed versus what you thought you needed. I read those books. Not because I was told to, he never told me to. I read them because they were there, and because the garage was where I spent most of my teenage Saturday afternoons, and because I was curious about the man who had so carefully assembled that particular collection. When I came back to Millhaven in January of 2019 and settled into the rhythm of the house, I started reading them again. More carefully this time. With the specific attention of a man who has realized, at 30 years old, that the path he thought he was on has quietly closed behind him and that he needs to find a different kind of map. My father, during his better hours in those early months after the stroke, talked to me. Not always coherently. Not always on subject. But sometimes, in the late afternoon when the light came through the kitchen window at a particular angle and his medications were balanced correctly, he would become lucid in a way that was almost startling, sharp, and precise, like he used to be. During those conversations, he told me things. He told me about a piece of land he owned, 43 acres east of town, that he'd bought in 1987 for almost nothing. He told me about the investments he'd made over the decades, small, boring, consistent. An S&P index fund he'd been contributing to since 1983. A handful of individual stocks he'd bought and never sold. A small rental property on the other side of town that he managed through a local company and never talked about at family events. He told me how much everything was worth. I didn't write it down during those conversations. I listened. But later, in my room, I opened my notebooks and wrote down everything I could remember. Numbers. Account names. Property descriptions. Not because I had plans for any of it, but because he was giving me a map and I understood instinctively that maps should be preserved. What he also told me in a voice lower than normal, in a way that told me this was different from the other conversations, was that he had updated his will. In 2020. He did it quietly, through Gerald Okoye, who had handled his affairs for 15 years. He said he'd done it because things had changed, because he had seen things, because he believed certain facts deserved to be formally acknowledged. He told me not to say anything to anyone. I didn't. And I wouldn't understand why until the afternoon of March 16, 2022, when Gerald Okoye placed 2 envelopes on a conference room table and said, "Your father asked me to read these in order." The 22 months between my mother's Parkinson's diagnosis and my father's death were the most difficult period of my life, and I say that without any desire for sympathy. I say it because the difficulty is part of the record. My mother's condition was manageable in the beginning. She was on medication, she was stable, she had good days more often than bad ones. But Parkinson's doesn't negotiate. It has a trajectory, and the trajectory is one direction. By the spring of 2021, she was having episodes of freezing that left her unable to move for stretches of time. By fall, she had fallen twice, once in the hallway, once in the bathroom. Neither times seriously. Both times terrifying. My father, who by this point had recovered to about 70% function on his left side through 2 years of grinding physical therapy, was watching his wife decline and was powerless to stop it. That powerlessness was, I think, harder for him than his own condition had been. He was a man who fixed things, who made things work, who understood that everything had a solution if you applied the right force in the right direction. And here is something he could not fix. I was managing 2 overlapping medical situations with a level of complexity that, had I written it as a project description, would have looked like a logistics nightmare. Medication schedules for 2 people, with different dosing windows and different interaction risks. 2 sets of doctor's appointments, often in the same week. Physical therapy for my father 3 times a week. Occupational therapy for my mother twice. Home health aides who came 3 mornings a week, but who couldn't be relied on for emergencies. I was also working. This is the part that people in Millhaven didn't know because I didn't talk about it. While my father slept and while my mother was in therapy, I had been, over the course of 3 years, building a small but functional consulting practice. Remote work, mostly, nothing glamorous. I used my engineering background to do project management work for small manufacturing companies that couldn't afford full-time staff. I had 4 clients. They paid retainer fees. The income was modest. It was enough. I also, using what my father had taught me and what I had spent those early waiting room hours learning in more depth, had begun making investments. Small ones. Consistent. I set aside a percentage of every retainer payment. Not because I had a grand plan. Because my father had taught me that money rewards patience more reliably than it rewards intelligence, and I had come to believe him completely. The financial situation around the estate was more complicated than anyone outside the family knew. My father had, over 50 years, assembled a modest but meaningful collection of assets. The house, paid off, worth somewhere around $380,000 in the current market. The land, 43 acres east of town, which had been worth almost nothing when he bought it, and which was now worth considerably more due to a combination of land appreciation and a quiet change in zoning that had happened in 2019. 2 investment accounts, a pension, a rental income stream. The question of what happened to those assets after his death was not something anyone talked about openly in the family, but it was something everyone was aware of. You could not be. I knew what the original will said. My father had shown it to me years ago, before any of the illness. Split evenly between Diane and me. Straightforward, clean, fair. What I didn't know, until the morning of March 16th, was what the second document said. And I was not the only one about to find out. My father was not a complicated man, but he was a precise one. The distinction matters. In the last year of his life, during the good hours, he and I had a ritual. After dinner, when my mother was resting and the house had settled into its evening quiet, he would sit in the worn brown armchair in the corner of the living room, the one he'd had since the mid-'80s, reupholstered twice, and I would sit on the couch, and we would talk. Sometimes about nothing. Sometimes about everything. In November of 2021, for months before he died, he said something to me that I didn't fully understand at the time. He said, "Marcus, a man's real will isn't what he writes down. It's what he does. But what he writes down is how he makes sure other people see what he did." I asked him what he meant. He said, "You'll understand. Gerald has everything." I didn't push further. My father was the kind of man who said things once. The machinery of him was built for single passes, not repetition. What I had come to understand, in those 4 years of close proximity to a man who had spent his life being precise, was something about how he thought about value. Not financial value specifically, though that was part of it, but human value. The value of presence. The value of work that doesn't announce itself. The value of someone who shows up not once at Christmas, but on a Tuesday at 3 in the morning when the blood pressure machine is alarming and the home health aide isn't answering her phone. My father saw all of that. He didn't always say it, but he saw it. And in 2020, he had asked Gerald Okoye to write it down. not to punish anyone. I want to be clear about this because it matters. He didn't do it out of bitterness or to create drama or to make a posthumous point. He did it because he believed, with the same precision he brought to everything, that the record should reflect reality. That a life honestly lived deserved to be honestly documented. The second envelope wasn't a weapon.
It was a witness statement.
The meeting at Gerald Okoye's office was scheduled for 10 in the morning on March 16, 2022. It was held in a small conference room on the second floor of a brick building on Clemont Street, 2 blocks from the county courthouse. The room had a single rectangular table, 8 chairs, a window overlooking a parking lot, and a framed print of an Ohio landscape on the wall that had probably been there since the building was renovated in 1998. Gerald Okoye was 61 years old, a quiet and methodical man who had been my father's attorney for nearly 2 decades. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and a dark gray suit, and he had, in all the years I had known him, never raised his voice or expressed an unnecessary emotion. He was the human equivalent of the work my father used to do, precise, controlled, and built to operate within very tight tolerances. There were 5 people in the room. Gerald, his paralegal, a young woman named Cassandra, who took notes. Diane, who had flown in from Chicago and was sitting with her hands folded on the table, wearing a dark blazer and the particular expression of someone who has already decided how this meeting ends. My mother, who was present but fragile, seated beside me with her hands in her lap. And me. Gerald opened by saying that Raymond Whitfield had left 2 documents, both legally executed, and that he was required by the terms of those documents to read them in sequence. Diane looked unsurprised. She had clearly assumed the 2 documents were drafts, an original and a revision that superseded it. She looked, if I'm being honest, slightly impatient. She had a flight back to Chicago at 4. Gerald read the first will. The one I knew. Split evenly, the house, the investment accounts, the personal property. Down the middle, 50-50. Simple and clean. As he read it, Diane relaxed slightly, the way people relax when they hear the confirmation of something they already believed. Then Gerald set that document down. He removed his glasses, cleaned them with a small cloth from his breast pocket, a gesture I had seen him make exactly once before, years ago, at a closing when something unusual had come up, and put them back on. He picked up the second envelope. Raymond also prepared and executed this document on September the 12th, 2020, he said. He asked me to read it in its entirety before anyone responds. Diane's expression changed. Not dramatically, she was too controlled for that. But something shifted in the set of her jaw. A small tightening. An involuntary recalculation. Gerald began to read. The second document was not, as Diane had assumed, a simple revision. It was a detailed letter, legally binding, witnessed, notarized, in my father's voice. It described, in plain language, the events of the previous 2 years. It described my return to Millhaven. It described, with specific dates, the caregiving work I had done. It cited the therapies I had coordinated, the medical crises I had managed, the nights I had stayed awake, the appointments I had driven to, the paperwork I had handled, the household I had kept running while maintaining my own income. And then it stated something else. It stated that Raymond Whitfield had, on multiple occasions, attempted to contact Diane to discuss the reality of the situation at home, and that those conversations had been brief, perfunctory, and had not resulted in any material change in her involvement. He did not say this with anger. He said it the way an engineer might note a finding: here is what was observed, here is the frequency, here is the outcome. The room was very quiet. Then Gerald turned to the asset distribution section of the second document and began to read the revised terms. I want to describe what happened in that room as Gerald read the revised distribution, because the way people react to unexpected information tells you more about them than anything they say when they're prepared. My mother made a small sound, not of surprise, but of something else. Recognition, maybe. The sound of someone hearing a thing said out loud that they already knew to be true. Diane went completely still. The 43 acres of land east of town, the land my father had bought in 1987 for next to nothing, the land that had appreciated significantly and had been quietly rezoned for mixed commercial use in 2019, was left entirely to me. The investment accounts, which had grown over decades of patient, consistent contribution, and which were now worth substantially more than anyone outside that room had understood, were split 60% to me, 40% to Diane. The house was to remain available to my mother for the duration of her life, and upon her passing would come to me. The rental property, which nobody in the family had known existed, was left entirely to me, with a note that explained my father had intended it as recognition of the work I had done managing complex, ongoing responsibilities without recognition or compensation. Gerald finished reading. He set the document down. He folded his hands. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Diane's face had gone through several phases of expression so quickly that I couldn't fully track them. I watched her arrive at something controlled, not acceptance, but the mask that sits in front of it, the professional composure she had been trained to maintain. She said, very quietly, "I'd like a moment." Gerald nodded. He and Cassandra left the room. My mother reached over and put her hand on mine. She didn't say anything either. She didn't need to. I sat in the conference room on Clemont Street and stared at the Ohio landscape print on the wall and understood, slowly, the full weight of what my father had done. Not just what he'd given me. What he'd given me was almost secondary. What he had done was look at 4 years of quiet, unacknowledged work and say, formally, legally, permanently, I saw this. This happened. This was real. That was the part that undid me. Not the land or the accounts. The witness. Diane came back into the room after 12 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock on the wall without meaning to, that automatic thing you do when you're waiting for something you can't predict. She sat down. She looked at me. And for a moment, a single, brief, unguarded moment, I saw something on her face that was not accusation and not composure, but something raw and complicated, the expression of a person who has just had a deeply held narrative collapsed without warning. She said, "I didn't know how bad it was." I said, "I know." She said, "I should have come more." I said, "Yes." There was nothing cruel in how I said it. I want that on the record. I wasn't waiting for this moment. I wasn't building toward it. I was simply, finally, in the position of being seen by the person whose opinion had mattered most in that room 2 days earlier, and I didn't feel triumph. I felt something more like exhaustion. What I didn't tell her, what I only fully understood myself in the days after, was the full picture of what I was now holding. The 43 acres east of town had been valued by the county assessor in 2021 at approximately $412,000. The commercial rezoning that had occurred in 2019 had made it significantly more attractive to developers. Within 6 months of my father's death, I had been approached by 2 separate parties about purchasing it. I didn't sell. I had been listening to my father's voice in my head for 4 years by that point, and his voice said, "Understand what you have before you decide what it's worth to someone else." The investment accounts, even at 60%, were more than I had expected. My father had been a quiet accumulator. He had bought the S&P index fund in 1983 at a time when most people his age were keeping savings in CDs and passbook accounts, and he had contributed to it every single paycheck for 33 years without interruption and without pulling from it once. The number Gerald read had a comma in a place I hadn't anticipated. The rental property generated $1,100 a month after management fees. Not transformative on its own, but consistent. My father's word. Consistent. And then there was the less tangible thing, the document itself. The second will, the letter, the formal record of what had happened in that house on Canfield Road. 47 people had been in that funeral room. 2 days later, there were 5 people in that conference room. But the truth only needs one witness. And mine had been one of the most precise, most honest men I had ever known. Word travels in Millhaven the way weather does. You don't see it coming, and by the time you feel it, it's already everywhere. I didn't say anything. I want to be very clear about that. I didn't make phone calls. I didn't explain myself to the cousins or the neighbors or the family friends who had been calculating my motives for 3 years over barbecue fences and kitchen tables. I simply went back to Canfield Road and took care of my mother. But Gerald Okoye had a paralegal, and the paralegal had a sister, and the sister worked at the diner on Main Street, and by the following Sunday, the temperature of the town had changed. The first thing I noticed was the calls. People I hadn't heard from in months, suddenly available. My Aunt Rosemary, who had given me the noble speech at Thanksgiving, called to say she had been thinking about me and hoping I was doing okay. My cousin Derek sent a text from Denver that said he was really proud of what you did, man. I read that text twice and then put my phone face down on the kitchen counter. The second thing I noticed was the silence at the gas station. The specific, loaded silence of a small town that is recalculating. The owner, a man named Terry who had known my father for 30 years and who had, at the 4th of July barbecue, been standing near the fence, nodded at me when I came in. Not the quick, dismissive nod of a man who has already sorted you into a category. A slow nod. The kind that comes with a slight adjustment of posture. Diane did not speak to me for 6 weeks after the meeting on Clemont Street. When she finally called, it was a Sunday evening in late April. I was sitting on the back porch of the house, watching the light change over the field behind the property. She said she had been thinking a lot about what the document said. She said she wanted to understand, if I was willing, what those years had actually looked like. I told her, not all of it at once, over several conversations across several weeks. I told her about the blood pressure readings and the medication schedules and the 3 a.m. alarms and the long afternoons in waiting rooms and the 2 nights my father had been hospitalized and I had sat in the hospital corridor until morning because there was no one else. She listened without interrupting, which, if you knew Diane, was significant. What I had not expected was that her listening would matter to me. I had told myself for years that I didn't need the acknowledgement, that I was doing what needed to be done regardless of who saw it. And that was true. But it turns out those things can both be true at once. You can do something without needing recognition and still feel something when the recognition finally comes. The 47 people in the funeral room never gathered in one place to formally revise their opinions. That's not how it works in real life. What happened was quieter and slower, and in some ways more complete, a gradual, collective adjustment in the way people looked at me. Not reverential. Not dramatic, just accurate. That was all I had ever wanted. By the end of 2022, I had made a series of decisions about the assets my father had left me that I want to describe not because they're remarkable, but because they're the direct continuation of everything he taught me. I did not sell the land. Instead, I spent 4 months researching the zoning situation, talking to planning commissioners, reading county development projections. I hired, for the first time in my life, a professional, a land use attorney out of Columbus who charged $400 an hour and who, within 2 weeks of reviewing the parcel, told me I had been significantly underestimating what I was holding. The rezoning wasn't just commercial. The parcel sat adjacent to a planned transit corridor expansion that the county had been quietly progressing for 2 years. With that corridor, the land's potential value changed considerably. I waited. In the spring of 2023, I received a formal offer from a regional development group for the 43 acres. The number was more than twice the county assessor's 2021 valuation. I didn't take it. My attorney told me to wait another 6 months. I waited. In November of 2023, the transit corridor expansion was officially approved at a county vote. 3 weeks later, a second offer came in. The number had grown again. I sold in December of 2023. The proceeds went into a carefully structured set of investments, index funds, primarily the same boring ones my father had used, plus a small position in a private credit vehicle my financial advisor recommended, and a reserve that I kept liquid. I also purchased a second rental property in Millhaven, a 4-unit apartment building near the old plant where my father had spent 33 years, which I renovated over the following spring with the help of 2 local contractors and a level of project management precision that, I will admit, came naturally. The rental income from the 2 properties combined was enough that my remote consulting work had shifted from necessity to choice. I still did it. I liked the work, but I was no longer running to keep up. My mother's health stabilized in ways that surprised even her doctors. She responded well to a new medication protocol we started in the fall of 2022, and while Parkinson's is not reversible, her quality of life through 2023 and into 2024 was, by any measure, good. She remained in the house on Canfield Road. I remained with her. In 2024, Diane and I arrived at something that I would describe as a functional reconciliation. Not the close relationship we might have had if things had been different, but a real one, honest and occasionally uncomfortable, built on the ground of what had actually happened rather than on the convenient version either of us might have preferred. She came for Thanksgiving. She stayed for 4 days, which was longer than she had stayed in years. She helped my mother with her exercises in the morning, and she sat at the kitchen table in the evening and drank coffee and talked. On the second night, she said, "I think Dad knew I needed to be shown, not told." I said, "Yeah, he was precise like that." She laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh in 2 years. It sounded like something returning. In the spring of 2024, my mother asked me to help her with something. She wanted to go through my father's library. Not to clear it out, she was very specific about that. She wanted to go through it and identify the books she thought I should keep, the ones she thought Diane might want, and the ones that should go to whoever might actually use them. We spent a Saturday afternoon doing it. She sat in the armchair, my father's chair, and I brought the books to her in stacks, and she looked at each one and said, "Sometimes yours, and sometimes Diane's, and sometimes just set it aside." When we got to the Benjamin Graham, she held it for a long time without saying anything. The cover had been repaired with electrical tape at some point in the 1990s. The pages were yellow at the edges. She said, "He read this one every few years. He said a book like this is different every time you read it because you're different." I said I already knew that one. She said, "I know you do." She handed it to me. I have it on my nightstand now. I've read it 5 times. I'm sure I'll read it again. What my father passed to me wasn't wealth in the traditional sense, though he passed that too. What he passed to me was a method. A way of seeing value that other people overlooked. A patience that was not passive but active. The patience of someone who is doing something while they wait, who is learning and observing and preparing while everyone else is assuming nothing is happening. He passed to me the understanding that precision is not a limitation. It's a form of respect for the material, for the work, for the time. I have started doing something that surprised me when I noticed myself doing it. On Sunday mornings, when the house is quiet and my mother is still sleeping, I sit at the kitchen table with coffee and I write things down. Not for anyone specific. Just observations, ideas, things I've learned that seem worth keeping. Some of it is financial. Some of it is about land, about how it behaves, about what I've learned from watching a single parcel of ground change value over time for reasons that have nothing to do with the ground itself and everything to do with context.
Some of it is about people.
About what it means to stay somewhere when leaving is easier. About what happens when someone sees you clearly and decides to say so, formally, in a document that outlasts them. I don't know yet who those notes are for. Maybe no one. Maybe someone specific, someday. But I know they're worth writing. My father taught me that some things need to be on the record. Here is what I know now that I did not know at 14, sitting on a milk crate in my father's garage. When he said money behaves according to its own rules and your job is to understand them, he wasn't just talking about money. He was talking about everything that has value. About relationships, about land, about time, about work, about presence. All of these things have rules that don't care about your feelings or your expectations. They respond to what you actually do, not what you intend to do. They respond to consistency and patience and attention. They compound quietly in the dark for years, without announcements. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the record gets set straight. Not in the way movies promise. Not with music and an audience and a moment of public vindication that makes everything feel resolved. It happens in a small conference room on a Tuesday morning with 5 people and a framed Ohio landscape that nobody chose deliberately. It happens in a single, low-voice sentence from a lawyer reading a document written by a man who is no longer alive but who understood, precisely, that the truth doesn't require a performance. It only requires a witness. My father was that witness for me. The white carnation I was holding at his funeral, I pressed it in the Benjamin Graham. It's still there, between chapters 9 and 10. Slightly brown at the edges now. Still holding its shape. Some things, if you're careful, hold their shape for a very long time.